So I just turned 50, and that's a bit of a milestone. It didn't catch up to me because I've been preparing for my 50th birthday for quite a while, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But that's what this episode is going to be about. Mainly a little bit of a recap and then looking into the future as to what I'll do with the time that I have left here on this nice planet that we all live on. So first off, I turned 50. And as I just explained, I had consciously been basically, on the one hand, preparing for it, on the other hand, looking for it. Now, why? Well, a lot of people get this kind of midlife crisis thing, and many years ago, I decided that I really like to avoid that because a lot of guys, I think, in particular men, maybe women a little bit less, in my opinion, but mostly men tend to go nuts at a certain point in their life. Well, to be fair, we get that more than once in our lives. But turning 50 for a lot of guys is this milestone that they have trouble with. And I decided a while ago that that wouldn't be me. So the worst thing you can do in this case is pretend it's not going to happen. Because if you ignore something, if you try to push it away, it always comes back to haunt you and bite you in the butt. So I decided to do the opposite. And for a while now, I've been very consciously living my last year of my 40s. I was 49. I'm like, okay, this is the last year before I turn 50. Talked to my kids a lot, jokingly said, when I'm 50, I'm going to be an old fart. So I'm going to start complaining and whining and tell everybody to get off my lawn, that kind of stuff. And they're like, no, you're not allowed to say you're old until you're 55. I'm like, okay, okay. So this is kind of a running joke in my family. But also, as we got closer to my birthday, I very much, you know, focused on everything that was going on and the plans that I have for the future, what my life was right now, compare it to the previous years so that it's not something that happened to me. Now, a lot of people view this differently. Some people want to be young forever and pretend that it's not going to happen to them getting old. Some people are of the opinion of like age is just a number, it doesn't matter, you shouldn't even, be thinking about this kind of stuff. It doesn't really matter, it's useless. I take a different route. My way is to try to look forward and look at what kind of problems could you run into and maybe try to avoid them. It is well established that midlife crises happen. Now, for some people, they come before their 50s, some is a little bit later. But for me, I was like, that's the one that I want to avoid. So that's why. And it's my podcast. So we're going to talk about my way of looking at things. Looking back, um, I started training when I was 13. So that's 37 years of training, which is by some standards quite a lot. By comparison to some of my peers and the people that I look up to, I haven't even scratched the surface. So, but it's not nothing either. And when I look at all the training that I did, the martial arts and self-defense training, it's brought me a lot, and I'm extremely lucky and grateful that I've been able to train for this long and first of all make it my profession. So I've been a personal trainer for a very long time, and I was actually already teaching before I did that professionally and became self-employed. So that's been almost 30 years now, which means that I am in the extremely fortunate position that I made a job, a profession out of my passion, out of what I love doing. There are very few people who can say that. Vast majority of people are doing a job that they really don't enjoy, but they have to make a living. And it's not in the cards for everybody to be in the position that I am and get up every day and go to work and be happy that you can do that and enjoy it. Now, I got up at 5:15 this morning. That was a little bit rough because I'm still nursing a jet lag. But even in those moments, my thought process is like, I'm so lucky that I get to do this because I have a 7 a.m. appointment, and then I finish, and then I have a 9:30 appointment, and then I can go home for a little bit, record the podcast as I'm doing now, and at 4 o'clock I have my next appointment, and so on. So I'm pretty free to do to organize my day how I want, to a certain degree, obviously. I have to take into account the schedules of my clients, but I've lived an amazingly free life, professionally speaking, thanks to uh, my passion for martial arts and self-defense. So again, that's it's been incredible. Turning 50 and looking back professionally and seeing that, dude, you've been able to do what you want for decades on end. That's extremely fortunate. So that is why I'm so grateful still for being able to train and teach and so on for all these many years and continuing to do so, because it's given me that, and I am very much aware of how rare that is. Like I mentioned, very few people get to do a job they actually love. That's one thing. Um, the other thing that the past 50 years has given me is I got to compete. I got to compete at home. I got to compete abroad. I got to travel. Thanks to traveling, met a bunch of wonderful people. Thanks to the internet 20 plus years ago starting to become a thing. And I know this sounds very strange to some of you listening, but there was a time before there was an internet. So, and before there was email, so that it was a very different world. And thanks to the internet happening and being able to get in touch with people all over, I developed a group of friends all over the world, and I've been able to visit them, have wonderful times with them, learn from them, and so on. Which again would have been impossible without my martial arts and self-defense training. And just to give you an idea, I've said this recently if I recall correctly, the Patreon live Zoom hangouts that I do every month. That back in the day when I started my first website, which is over 20 years ago, um, I emailed Mark McKeown to ask him if it was okay if I put a link to his website on my website. That is how early days it was back then, because that was, we thought like, okay, I'll just politely ask if it's okay if I do that, because nobody knew what the rules are. There weren't much rules, and the internet was new and everybody was doing something. So what was the etiquette? How do you go about putting links on your website to somebody else? Is that okay or not? Or you asked permission or not? Nobody knew. So, and that's how I got in touch with Mark, because I was reading his books and got in touch with a bunch of other people through Mark's email list and so on. And then through my blog, through my videos, people contacted me. So I've been extremely fortunate to develop amazing friendships over all these past decades, thanks to my passion for martial arts and self-defense. I just came back from spending a wonderful time with Barry Eisler and his wife, who become great friends, my best friends right now. And that sounds a little bit weird, given that they live across the ocean from me. But we struck up a friendship, and it's been great, and we get along fine. And it's also always a wonderful time for me and my girlfriend to visit them and spend some time together. It's unfortunately not as much as we would like. We'd always like to stay longer, but until we win the lottery, it's going to have to be pretty much as it is right now. But the point is that we would never have met if it weren't for the training and the teaching that I do. And that has been true consistently throughout my professional life, is that I've met so many people I would never have met without that. I've talked to numerous high level CEOs of multinational companies, talked to athletes, actors, entertainers, musicians, and so on. But a bunch of people. I usually don't talk about that all that much unless it's public knowledge, because it's nobody's business, and it's a part of my profession. Being a personal trainer is that you have to be discreet about your client list. But some of the people on there, I'm pretty sure most of you listening to this would actually know. So the point is not boasting. It's just that um, I wanted to take this time to explain how freaking lucky that I've been. And I remember when I started professionally, that my friends were telling me like, dude, you're crazy. You're never going to be able to make a living of this. It's just a hobby. It's never going to work. And I'm like, here I am. You know, that was back when I was 19, 20 years old. We're 30 years later now. I'm like, okay, well, what did you do with your life? Well, you spent it behind the desk. Maybe you enjoyed it, but it was very different from my life. I had a wonderful time. Not quite sure if you could say the same thing. So that's one thing. So that's a lot of the good that I've had. I mean, I've learned so much along the way, meeting these very interesting people. Uh, but there was also a cost to it, in a large part because of my own stupidity and being young and dumb and not really knowing what you were doing or not listening to good advice. For instance, I have many chronic injuries. I've had a bunch of surgeries and so on, that I've talked about at length, so I'm not going to repeat it here. But that's the price that that I have to pay and will have to pay increasingly. So because there's that price is going to go up and up as I get older. There are plenty more surgeries in my future, so eventually I'll get to that. But that it has been the cost of training as much as I did and not resting enough and so on. So you often get this question of, would you do the same thing if you could start over? Yes, but I try to be smarter about it to avoid some of the injuries that I have now, and obviously not waste time with things that in hindsight were basically a waste of time, and not care as much about certain details that in hindsight aren't really all that important. And especially with the injuries, a lot of them were avoidable if I would have just taken more rest, as opposed to keep on grinding day after day, hours on end. When my body started complaining that and basically resisting that amount of training, that was it. Turned out after the problem started, this is over 10 years ago, that turns out that I don't have really a great body for hardcore martial arts training. Turned out that I wasn't born with any innate gifts, quite on the contrary. So, and you only figure that out once the problems start, which is why I talk so often about my injuries and the chronic problems. Because many people have asked me that, and some people have been a little bit, um, how should I put it, not really adversarial, but kind of like, dude, why do you keep on talking about that? That's not what a real man does. Which immediately for me is like, if you want to do the macho bullshit stuff, I'm not your guy. Just if you think that you, for some reason that diminishes me, fine, whatever. But we don't see eye to eye on that front. Main point for me is that I see very few people who actually have lived a very violent lifestyle, much more so than I, due to being a violence professional, due to being a high level competitor or whatever, it doesn't matter. But having trained as hard and having fought really hard and accumulated truckloads of injuries, there are very few people who are very open about it. I find with athletes it's more, but with a lot of violence professionals, they don't really like to talk about it. Now, I understand why. There are reasons why you wouldn't want all that information to be out there. But at a certain point, it's just that it tends to create this myth of being invulnerable, and that, yeah, but the injuries are no big deal there. Yeah, it sucks, but you get over it. But you don't always do, though. And in many cases, there's a price to pay in the long run. The wear and tear on your body actually, it's a pretty high toll. It always reminds me of the old Roadhouse movie with Patrick Swayze, where he starts dating this doctor, and she says, "You're gonna be in a lot of pain when you get older." And he kind of laughs it off. He says, "Yeah, I know." She says, "How do you know?" "Well, because they tell me so." But it's true. If you train hard, you fight hard often, you tend to accumulate a bunch of injuries. Now, For me, because I teach, I think it is an integral part of teaching and instructing to also talk about that part. Because a lot of the stuff is preventable, avoidable. If you understand that it will happen to you, unless you are the one exception to the rule who has the genetics to basically breeze through all these injuries and not really have any long term consequences. Those people exist, but they are extremely rare. Thinking that you'll be the one, maybe that's a little bit of hubris talking. So, how about you maybe consider some of the stuff that I talk about when it comes to prevention and managing your body correctly so it doesn't, when you get older, so it doesn't start giving you the check for past transgressions, as we call it. So, anyway, that's pretty much talking about that. From my perspective, I've lived an amazing life. I've done a truckload of stuff that most people never got to do. I've seen so many parts of the world. I haven't been on all continents, but I've been to a fair amount of them. I haven't seen all countries, but I've traveled to a fair amount of them and met all sorts of people from all sorts of walks in all these different countries. So I've been very fortunate in that way. That brings me to look into the future. Again, once you're 50, I don't remember what the exact average lifespan of a male is right now where I live. But if I'm realistic, I think, you have to face the facts that I have less time before me than I have behind me. So if I get another 20, 30 years out of my lifetime, that'll be probably realistic. And then I'll consider myself lucky. That immediately also means that you focus more and more as you get older on what actually matters to you. And it's a cliche, obviously, but as you get older, a lot less, many things become less important. Is a better way to phrase it. Some of the things you thought were so important in your 20s and 30s become irrelevant once you get a little bit older. And that keeps on obviously evolving throughout time, the less time you have left. So, where am I right now with all this? Well, I just spent 2 weeks traveling to the United States. Like I said, first with good friends, and then a little bit of travel, a little bit of work. Um, and had more time to think about a lot of stuff. Most of all is, well, Wim, what do you do with the rest of your life? And decisions I've obviously already came to, but crystallized maybe a little bit more now this past few weeks is focus on what's important. What is that? Well, first it's my loved ones, my partner, my kids, my friends, and spending time with them. Like I said, unfortunately, they are all across the world, so that's more difficult than I would like it to be. But I do the best I can. Um, at the same time, another focus point is keep on training. Why? Well, because I enjoy it. Because by far, I don't think I've reached the bottom of that barrel. That I have so much more to learn, and that there's so much more to discover, or to fine tune, or to reassess, and so on. I hope that I can always be a student first and maybe an instructor second. But there's so much that I'm interested in that I would love to do, and I try to get that in as much as I can. But I keep on training, I keep on teaching, and now the training for me is mostly about maintaining my health and avoiding more injuries or managing the injuries that I do have. So that is a very different focus than, for instance, when I was in my 20s and 30s when I wanted to be in the best shape possible, be as strong, as fast, and explosive as I could possibly be. Whereas right now, you have to be realistic about these things. I mean, there are some guys who compete in their 50s in full contact fighting, but again, not that long ago, there was a fight between Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock, and Royce won. Neither man was very much like the competitor they were 20, 30 years before that. I mean, they still looked great. That's not the issue. But if you look at their prime and then look at them in that fight, it's not the same. Now, again, no shade to them at all, because you have to have balls to step into the octagon at that age, at any age, basically. I always respect people who step into the arena, because everybody who doesn't know what they're talking about. So a lot of respect for that. But for me, it's mostly, what are you doing if at that age you're still fighting? First off, what do you have left to prove? I guess nothing, in my opinion. On the other hand, if the octagon or the ring keeps calling you, at that age, maybe you should stop listening to that call, because the potential for injuries is so much greater. And by that I mean permanent injuries. If in your 50s you take a really bad knockout, or you take a really hard beating in the octagon or in the ring, you're not just simply going to recover from that as you do when you're in your 20s. So I always find it a little bit, sad when I see older fighters still compete, even if they're still great. But it's like, it's an accident waiting to happen. So I vowed that I wouldn't do that. So I stopped earlier for more reasons. I was also, you know, wanted to have a family. So that was where I live, incompatible with competing at a high level. Um, so all that stuff is behind me. I'll still train pretty hard. I mean, yesterday in class we sparred, not necessarily all that hard, but we sparred for 6 rounds and had a great time. It was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it. I'm a little bit sore today because I hadn't sparred in over 4 weeks for a variety of reasons. But it was fun. I enjoyed it. Students enjoyed it, and I got to teach. They got to learn some stuff because I kicked one student in the face. I managed to counter another one really well. I managed to land a combination that we just practiced beforehand, and then did it in sparring, and then said to my student, "Look, do you recognize it?" Said, "Yeah, that's what we just did." I said, "There you go. Here you see how it works." So a lot of fun, but I'm not going to spar like I used to when I was preparing for a competition. That's just, that would be stupid. So my focus in training has shifted a lot more away from all the hardcore stuff. I still train pretty hard compared to most people, but not as hard as I did before, simply because I would accumulate even more injuries, and old injuries would get worse. So that's not the point. I also shift a lot more away from combat sports. I still teach my MMA class, and I still practice, obviously, but the self-defense part of training has, for the last 20 years, become more important than the combat sports aspect. Obviously, because I won't be competing, but I might actually still be in a situation where I have to defend myself. So, okay, that's what we focus on. And the old adage of, you know, learn to fight like an old man, because one day you will be. Although that's me. I I have to focus on that more and more, which means a different way of focusing it. Now, the main thing is that when you say that, people think like, oh, you have to be the supreme grand master who, with just, the slightest touch of his pinky finger, hits this dim mac point and knocks out some thug trying to rob him. That is not at all what I'm talking about. It means that you don't assume that you can soak up damage, for instance, like you could when you were much younger, and you also don't assume that you can be in a long, protracted fight that takes minutes and minutes and minutes, and that you'll have the cardio to keep going. That's going to work out like it used to. That's not smart now. The other side of that coin is that if you're fighting for a minute straight in a self-defense context, there's something seriously wrong here. That your tactics suck. So, barring some exceptions, but that then something's really wrong. So the focus of my training has shifted, basically, and that's what I concentrate on more and more as time goes by. And then there's work, in the sense, the online work that I do, the writing and so on. Um, I made a new production schedule that I'm figuring out for this month of May. So it's the first month. We're in the first week, and I shared it online recently on my social media, and it's the first stab at it in the sense that I'm trying to reorganize a bunch of stuff, both professionally with the training that I do with clients, but also with the way that I do everything online, so that it is more efficient and I get more done in less time, which means that I have more time to do other things that are important to me. For instance, the podcast. I want to get more guests on and basically have an episode every week. So the schedule is that there's one episode of me talking, like now, and then there's an You're Not Aries podcast, which is the short episodes, hopefully, 10, 15, 20 minutes max. And then there's an interview. Then there's another You're Not Aries podcast, and then another one with me, and so on. So the cycle is basically 4 weeks of is a typical cycle. So I'm trying to plan that ahead as much as possible. It is sometimes really difficult because getting guests on is very tricky sometimes because everybody's busy and nobody owes me their time to do an interview. So it's sometimes tricky to set it up. I very often have a time zone difference, especially with the guests who are in the US. It's figuring out time zones, and that can get really difficult sometimes because everybody, again, is very busy. So that's why sometimes I announce a guest and ask my patrons for questions for the bonus episode. But sometimes it takes months on end before, or even a year before we actually are able to pull it off. Like with the interview that I did with Mark Dacascos, it was planned a year beforehand. Now, he has a very hectic schedule, obviously. So it's not like I mean, he can just get away from doing movies and TV shows and so on, spend some time talking to me. So it's not as easy as we sometimes make it sound like, hey, there's an interview I did with this and that guy. Here you guys can listen to it. That's not how it works. If you're Joe Rogan, people want to be on your show. That's not where I'm at with my podcast. Maybe one day, hope springs eternal. But for now, it's quite tricky. Now, in that said, if you have ideas and suggestions for guests, you can always write a comment on my social media. Is the best way to do that. Write a comment on my Facebook page or on Instagram, wherever you want, and I'll consider it and see if I can get in touch with them. It's not always easy. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it doesn't. But that's kind of the goal going forward, having an episode every week. Short one, longer one, me talking, a guest talking, and so on. Obviously, there's all the work that I do on my various online platforms. I've got my Patreon, in which I make 4 different videos every month. I've got my online Tai Chi Chuan. MMA formula is also something that I'm going to pick up again. That's quite a bit of time. Video production takes a lot of work, but I enjoy it. And I'm always happy when I get, comments and feedback from people that, oh, this is cool. You helped me out with that one. For instance, my video I did on how to work with the heavy bag and empty it out without actually having to refill it. That video I still get a lot of comments on. People were looking for something like that. So that's something that I enjoy when something I do helps people out. Because I remember back in the day when I started training, again, no internet, very few books, very few videos. So there wasn't a lot of information. So you had to figure it all out by yourself. And a lot of the things that I talk about now is stuff that I would have loved to have, you know, as information when I needed it. So, and that's why me trying to pay it forward. Everything that I received thanks to martial arts and self-defense training, I try to pay it forward a little bit by doing truckloads of free stuff on my blog and on my social media and on my YouTube channel and so on. So more of that coming. Then the big one, writing. Like I mentioned before, writing takes a lot of headspace for me. So I really have to get inside my own head, get into the right frame of mind, have sufficient time to get in that frame of mind, and then have enough time to keep writing for a few hours so it starts flowing, and then do that consistently for several days on end. preferably weeks. Doesn't always work out because, like I said, I do have a full-time job already and I have these other things to get to. So with the new schedule, what I'm trying to do is get all the stuff that I mentioned just now, get that done in the first 2 weeks, and then the last 2 weeks of the month would be dedicated to writing. There's some writing that I'm doing in between, just so it's not always starting from scratch. Because for me, and for every author, it's different. For me, writing is like training, is use it or lose it. If I don't write regularly, it becomes difficult and it takes a while to get back into it again. Whereas if I'm writing every day or every other day, it's much, much easier. So the first few weeks when I'm mainly doing video and podcast production, I'm still trying to write for like half an hour every day, mostly working on blog posts. I've got one coming up. I'll talk about that in the end. But writing Boxing for Self-Defense 1.5, the addendum book, um, trying to finish that one as quickly as possible. Hopefully with this new production schedule, it's going to work. Hopefully with the war in Ukraine and the coming recession, I will have enough time and be in the opportunity to keep on doing that. There's a lot of stuff going on, obviously, in everybody's life. But again, hopefully I can finish that book soon and get that out so I can start on Boxing for Self-Defense 2 and then 3 and maybe even 4 depending on how well 3 goes. So, but it's a lot of work. Writing, as I've said before, takes the most of my time. It's the hardest thing to do and it takes the most of my time to get into the right mindset and then actually get the words on paper. So that's why it takes so long. Some people are much quicker than I am when it comes to writing. Some are much slower and everybody's different. I just made a joke to Lawrence Kane because he's got 20 plus books now, and I said, look, I'm gonna have to catch up to you. I mean, I really have to try and catch up to you, and maybe one day catch up to Lauren Christensen, who's got what is it, 60 plus books out now. So, and they both laughed at my attempt at humor, but gotta have goals, so that's mine eventually. Getting through all the long list of book projects that I have, I've got I think 36 book projects, and every now and then I think of a new one and keep adding it. Get that stuff done as quickly as possible, and so a lot of you folks who are asking me about the next Boxing for Self-Defense book so that I can basically deliver on that promise that I made. What else was also coming up, what I want to work on, it's a project that I've had for a long time in my head, but I haven't really worked on it because it's a big project. And recently I asked my patrons, like, okay, what do you guys want? What would you like me to do for the 5-year anniversary of being on Patreon? And one of my patrons gave a good idea. It's anything with about teaching martial arts, and as a result also learning, because for me learning and teaching is two sides of the same coin. So I'm working on that. I have been working on that for a while now, and after I finish with the Boxing for Self-Defense book, I'm going to focus on that one, and that is going to be a lecture or a series of lectures actually, because it's probably going to be quite long, which is me in front of a whiteboard explaining and maybe adding in some pictures and short videos of what I'm talking about and so on. And in short, everything that the last 37 years of training and teaching have taught me that I think might be useful for you, both as a student, a practitioner, and as an instructor. When will that be done? I have no idea, because again, that is a lot of work. But it's what we call a project from the heart, as opposed to from the mind, meaning that something that I'm really passionate about teaching. So I want to do a good job and I want to put in the work. It's going to be free for my patrons when it comes out, but likely I'll put it on for sale as a video on my Vimeo channel. I'll put a link in the show notes already for that, so you can follow me there whenever it comes out. Again, don't ask me when, don't ask me how many hours it's going to be. If you know my stuff, you know that usually I am not shy in adding content, meaning that it's usually much bigger than most people are expecting. Um, Back in the day when I did my first Paladin Press videos, the Combat Sancho series, the first 3 DVDs, that was the longest, the biggest project they've ever done. I don't know if afterwards they did anything that was longer or bigger, but I have no idea. But back then we had, I think, was it 7 hours of video that we shot? I mean, a lot. So I tend to add more as opposed to leave out. And you can always choose if you don't want to watch it or read it. But if I don't put it in there, you don't get that choice. That's how I see it. It needs to make sense. I don't add just for adding. I add because I think it's necessary or it is valuable to add it in there when I write, when I make a video, and so on. And just you know, for shits and giggles, I got my start as a writer by first writing articles on my very first website. Struck up a friendship with Lauren Christensen, and he said, "You want to write a book with me?" I'm like, okay, I guess, because I didn't see myself as an author. And he taught me writing, and he taught me the ropes, and he showed me the ropes, and he taught me pretty much everything. And he made the joke that at first he had a hard time getting me to actually write enough. Because I would write something and be very self-conscious, like, is this really any good? Do I actually want to send this? And I'd send it in, and he said, "Oh, expand on this," and yeah, that's good, but more and more and more. And then after a while, he said, at first I couldn't get you to write enough, and then I couldn't get you to shut up. And I laughed because it's true. Stephen King has a good bit about that in one of his books. It's called On Writing, which is a memoir and also an instructional manual on the craft of writing. It's a really great book. And he said some people are natural lever outers, and he says I'm a natural putter inner, meaning that he puts always more stuff in as opposed to leave stuff out, which is why he writes epic length novels in many of his books. That's also my style more. I have to cut and edit a lot more as opposed to add in because it's missing. Right. So that's coming in, and in short, all that, what does that mean? When I look to the future for the next 20, 30 years, before I leave this realm and go into the afterworld or whatever it is, we'll see or not, no idea. I would like to leave behind my contribution to the self-defense and martial arts world, whatever it may be, however useful it may be. I hope people find a use for it when I'm gone. And if not, then maybe it's a cautionary tale to don't do what that guy said. Who knows? But that would be my goal. And we'll see where I end up. I have no idea. I'll do the best I can. I think that's pretty much the only thing I can promise. And hopefully, maybe if I have another 50 years, who knows? That would surprise me. If I go beyond 80 years old, I would consider it bonus time. I would consider it that I'm, one of the lucky ones who gets more years than that. And maybe I get to write more than still. Lauren's still writing, and he's a fair bit older than me. So maybe I can do the same thing. We'll see. I'll do my best. Right. So that's pretty much the end of the podcast. What's coming next? Well, like I said, I'm setting up interviews for the show because I was in the US for the past 2 weeks. I couldn't set up anything because I don't have all my equipment with me when I travel. The recording equipment, trying to set that up, and we'll try to release those podcasts as quickly as possible. And then the next big thing coming out is my article on how to train with edged weapons. It's an article that I've started writing a long time ago, but again, as I mentioned, writing time sometimes harder to get. So I'm almost done with it. I have to write a few more paragraphs, and then I'm done. Then it's revision time, and then I can publish. And I think a lot of people might enjoy this because it touches on some subjects that I often feel are missing. In particular, for people who are in the beginning stages of their training or who are new to training with edged weapons. If you've been training for a long time, there's a good chance you know all this. But I have to say that some of the things that I'll mention in my article, I've seen people with many decades of trading make those, in my opinion, mistakes as well. And if I'm being honest, which I try to be, I make those mistakes too if I don't pay attention. I think we're only human, and that means we're fallible. So it's trying to avoid some of the mistakes. I think that's valuable if we can get to that point. And that is the purpose of the article, to help people when you train with edged weapons. Okay, what are some of the things you have to look out for and take into consideration so it actually translates into real life self defense skills. But that's it. End of the show. So this one comes out next week. There's going to be UNL Aries podcast, and then hopefully the week after that, there's going to be the next interview. Again, as always, if you want to do something to help out the podcast, make it grow, like, share, subscribe. The best thing you can do is just share the link to this podcast with friends and family, or people who you think you might enjoy it, because I don't have an advertising budget. This is just a small operation. So anything that you can do to share and make the audience grow, that would be great. The bigger the audience, the easier it is for me to get guests on that you might want to hear me talk to. That's kind of always something you have to keep in mind. The bigger the podcast gets, the easier it is to get the really awesome guests that everybody wants to hear talk. So it's doing both you and me a favor. And as always, there's my Patreon where I've got a truckload of unique content that is not available anywhere else. Bonus episodes, instructional videos, much, much more. Check that out. There's something at every level of the reward tiers. And you might enjoy that too. All right, folks, signing out. Talk to you next time.